And the Clinton administration has, through official inaction, passively abetted the expansion of Beijing's narco-terrorism network. This is another very important issue in light of the fact that we are constantly urged to make all kinds of sacrifices of our liberty in the name of the so-called war on drugs. Beijing is, as it has been for decades, the chief kingpin in the international narcotics trade. Mr. Clinton has received hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars from Red Chinese sources that are directly implicated in narco-terrorism. That is a matter of some significance. Costco, once again, is involved in drug smuggling as well. Beijing's covert espionage network within the United States has expanded dramatically during the Clinton administration, including infiltration of sleeper agents or agents under discipline, saboteurs, terrorists. You know the menagerie. It has been growing by leaps and bounds during the era of the Clinton administration. Let's talk about each of these very briefly in course. This is done in order to establish what Red China has gotten in exchange for its rather modest investment in Mr. Clinton. Most of you are acquainted with what happened in February of 1996 when a communications satellite jointly owned by Loral Space Technologies and Hughes Communications blew up shortly after liftoff in Red China. The reason why that missile was allowed to be launched carrying an American-made satellite was because Bill Clinton signed a waiver, an export control waiver allowing that satellite to be launched. Why was the waiver necessary? It was necessary because that satellite contained an encryption chip. Encryption chips are the key to computer-aided, satellite-guided information technology, especially military application technology. Very much coveted by Red China, the encryption technology. As a matter of fact, this technology was so highly classified and so privileged that Mr. Clinton refused to sign an export waiver allowing a similar satellite to be exported to Australia for launch. Australia is an ally of the United States. We have a treaty of alliance with the Australians. Red China is our chief adversary, but Mr. Clinton signed that waiver to allow that launch. In the aftermath of this disaster, technicians from Loral and Hughes helped the Red Chinese conduct a post-mortem, and this involved the transfer of specific technical information that allowed them to perfect the launch reliability of the Long March missile, which is used to launch communication satellites. Now, why is this significant? This is significant because the Long March missile is the delivery vehicle for Red China's nuclear warheads. So by providing them with this particular technical information, they improve the launch reliability of the chief delivery system should we ever find ourselves under attack by Red China. This, of course, is a very dire state of affairs. The Pentagon certified in May of 1996 that national security had been harmed by this transfer of technology. In early 1998, while a Justice Department investigation was going on to determine to what extent our national security had been harmed and whether Loral and Hughes should be brought up on charges for violating export control laws, Mr. Clinton quietly signed another set of waivers to cover exactly the same technologies, thereby undercutting the investigation by the Justice Department of this incident back in 1996. He was abetting a cover-up. He was abetting a crime by covering up through the issuance of these waivers. This was done, by the way, when Congress was out of session. Among the things recovered by the Red Chinese technicians in the debris of that Long March missile was the circuit board containing the encryption chip in that satellite. This was something that was misplaced by Mr. Clinton once again. Do you see something of a pattern here? I suggest that puts into an interesting light the fact that we lost these 2 cruise missiles in Afghanistan that somehow ended up in Red Chinese hands. So the Red Chinese now have a launch vehicle capable of delivering a payload to any city in the continental United States. Before the intervention of Hughes and Loral in February of 1996, just about every Long March missile that was launched blew up. Since that time, it has a perfectly reliable record of launches. They have perfected the means to deliver their payload. And during the Clinton administration's tenure in office, we've discovered that they now have a payload that they can deliver in the form of the W-88 warhead, which is used on our Trident missile. The W-88 warhead is a small enough warhead that you can put multiple warheads on a single missile. This is called MIRVing technology. They have the means, now they have the warhead. The warhead was stolen, apparently, from Los Alamos. This, of course, is something which has been in the news quite a bit recently. Paul Redmond, who is the CIA counterintelligence officer who caught Aldrich Ames, said that what was going on at the Los Alamos laboratory, weapons laboratory run by the Energy Department, was worse than the Rosenbergs. The Rosenbergs, of course, stole the atomic secrets that provided the Soviet Union with the means to build an atomic bomb. It was discovered that there were security problems at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in 1995. It wasn't until this year that the official responsible, or the official who was suspected of being the source of the leak, Wen-Ho Lee, was fired. The Rosenbergs were executed for their treason. Wen-Ho Lee was actually promoted, and he kept his security clearance after he fell under suspicion for being the source of the leak to the Red Chinese. And then eventually he was fired. His wife, by the way, we have just discovered recently, was an informant for the FBI between 1985 and 1991. I had mentioned the architects, the military architects of the Tiananmen Square massacre. August of 1994, Lieutenant General Zhu Huisi was welcomed in Washington. General Zhu was the fellow who gave the saddle-up order to the people who raided Tiananmen Square, the stormtroopers who crushed the protesters beneath the treads of tanks. It was General Zhu who did so. He was brought to our country, and at the expense of a little more than $13,000, he was given very good hospitality in Washington and in Hawaii. He was welcomed at the Annapolis Naval Academy and allowed to address the students at the Naval Academy. The Clinton administration, according to the book Year of the Rat, a wonderful expose that I heartily recommend, was, quote, prepared to say that Zhu was just following orders at Tiananmen Square. Of course, that phrase has a rather unfortunate resonance. They were also willing, that is, the Clinton administration was also willing to commend and to welcome the individual who gave the orders to raid Tiananmen Square. His name is Chi Hua-tien. In December of 1996, Chi Hua-tien was brought to this country and given a 19-gun salute in front of an honors cordon at the Pentagon, standing next to the Secretary of Defense, William Perry, at the time was the Secretary of Defense, who has his own connections to Red China. He was treated to the salutes of our men in arms, members of our armed services. The Secretary of Defense of the United States referred to him as my colleague, not my counterpart, my colleague. He sees his relationship with General Chur as a collegial one. General Chur was allowed to go to the National Defense University in Maryland. And during that speech, he had the temerity to say that not a single person was killed in Tiananmen Square. And nobody was willing to challenge him. In advance of General Chur's visit to the United States, the unclassified biography that was provided by the Clinton administration for the media was carefully sanitized of any reference to Tiananmen Square. It was carefully expunged of any reference to the fact that he had killed American servicemen in Korea. You have the Clinton administration here engaging in disinformation on the part of Beijing. Why does Bill Clinton earn the high endorsement of the head of Red China's military intelligence? I suggest that's as good a reason as any. I had begun my remarks by referring to Mr. Clinton's ideological inclinations and saying that whether or not he acknowledges them, they should be grouped under the heading of socialism. June 19th of last year, it was June 19th of 1998, Mr. Clinton, just before he went to China for a summit, was asked by a reporter in an Oval Office interview the following question: would you like to see the end of communism in China, and is that a goal of American policy? This is not a brain buster. There is an obvious answer, and that answer is one word: yes, or perhaps yes, of course, 3 words. 723 words later, Mr. Clinton hadn't answered the question. He referred to the need for coherence and stability in China, which presumably can only be brought about through naked coercion. He talked about how instability is something which is very wounding to the Chinese psyche, as if Mr. Clinton were qualified to assess the state of the Chinese inner life. The point here is Mr. Clinton did not seize the obvious opportunity to say what I think anybody who is not a studiously perverse practitioner of power politics, such as Henry Kissinger, or somebody who is not a bought and paid for employee of Red China would say, which is communism is a crime against the human soul, and it is the policy of our government to oppose it. He couldn't say that. By way of bringing this discussion to a close, very briefly, I want to go over the parcel of rogues who were involved in the buying of the presidency of the United States. Most of us know the roll call, but it's worth reviewing what they did and naming names and taking down for the record what they did in order to explain to some extent why it is that Mr. Clinton has been so malleable in the hands of Beijing. James and Mokhtar Riyadi, the ethnic Chinese who preside over the Lippo conglomerate in Indonesia. They're from the Fujian province in China, which is one of the major recruiting grounds for Chinese gangsters, the Triads. James Riyadi was the largest single donor to Mr. Clinton's campaign in 1992. Chinagate did not begin in 1994, 95, or 96. James Riyadi gave $450,000 to Bill Clinton, and the Riyadi family also gave another $600,000 to the Democratic National Committee, or DNC. It was the Riyadi-owned Worthen Bank in Arkansas that gave a critical $3.5 million loan to the Clinton campaign on the eve of the 1992 New York primary. This was after the major bimbo eruption of Campaign 92 took place, the Gennifer Flowers disclosures. It looked as if Mr. Clinton was done politically. He got this key loan of $3.5 million from a Riyadi-owned bank. Once again, Mr. Clinton's connection to China goes back an appreciable distance. Now, the Riyadi money was critical in silencing Webb Hubbell in 1994. Webb Hubbell, of course, was an associate attorney general. He was a crony in the Whitewater operation in Arkansas. He confronted the prospect in 1994 of going to prison. He was penurious at the time. He was completely without money. He was willing to cooperate with the investigation of independent counsel Kenneth Starr to provide testimony, which would have damaged both Bill and Hillary Clinton. Suddenly, $600,000 in hush money is thrown his way in the form of consulting fees for unspecified tasks. The largest chunk of that came from the Riyadis. The Riyadis are once again the head of the Lippo conglomerate, which has been identified as a front essentially for the Red Chinese government. And both James and Mokhtar Riyadi have been identified as agents of the Chinese government. They supplied the payoffs to Webster Hubbell. Webster Hubbell, exercising the doctrine of omerta, remained silent and went to jail rather than making a deal and staying out of jail. At this point, a competent investigator would have said, why is my key witness being silent? Where did the money come from to buy his silence? Kenneth Starr chose not to pursue that avenue of investigation. It would have taken him right into Chinagate in 1994. Instead of doing so, a couple of years later, we ended up getting involved in this huge distraction called the Lewinsky scandal. That in 1994, had Mr. Starr been blessed with the rudimentary curiosity one would associate with a diligent investigator, we would have seen a tremendous amount of exposure being given to the Chinagate scandal had he pulled on this thread, and he chose not to do so for reasons that he has not yet been asked to explain. In exchange for this payoff to Webb Hubbell, John Huang was inserted into the Commerce Department at the specific instigation of Bill Clinton. John Huang is an identified agent of Red China. He is the key to a lot of what's happened in Chinagate. He was